Welcome to the Roaring Twenties, a time when jazz was the bee's knees and Louis Armstrong was the big cheese. At this point in time, our nation was tired of war and the people were ready to have some fun. Music was a major source of letting out steam and even an outlet for youths to rebel against their parents. Jazz music exploded through the night and the dancing soon followed. The dance floor was full of limbs thrashing about, or maybe they were just doing the Charleston. And who can dance that fast without a drink or two in their system? Despite the 18th Amendment, certain nightclubs illegally sold alcohol to customers while they enjoyed the music. Once Louis Armstrong began playing his trumpet, one could not help but dance. Just his voice alone was enough to make your legs twitch. The talents of musicians such as Jelly Roll Morton paved the way for many black musicians to cross racial boundaries and perform in locations generally attended by whites. Women during the time period would get all dolled up at night and find ways to sneak away and party with the men. The music craze became the new and modern culture of cities, allowing teenagers to challenge traditional values.
Jazz was an amorphous genre of music evolved during the late 1910s. Jazz was invented by African Americans as a way of expressing their feelings of social inequality during the period. Artists like James P. Johnson, a piano player, helped to bring the transition of ragtime to jazz. He wrote the song Charleston, which inspired the dance of the same name. Not all jazz artists were black. George Gershwin was a white composer who wrote a mix of Tin Pan Alley and jazz music. His music is still widely used by artists today. Jazz was heavily influenced by ragtime, European music, and African American church music. Jazz had its origins as dance music in New Orleans' Storyville until the party scene died down in 1917. Musicians then traveled to northern cities like Chicago, Kansas City, and New York, which became centers for performance and recording. Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five created some of the most influential and hotsy-totsy jazz records in history. Armstrong originally played the cornet for local New Orleans Dixieland jazz bands, and he eventually became the selling point for his band. He is credited with inventing scat singing and creating modern jazz. He is still the cat's pajamas to musicians today. Duke Ellington was a composer and a pianist and is known as the King of Jazz. He played with his orchestra and played in New York's Cotton Club starting in 1927. Jazz was prominent during an age of optimism after the First World War when Americans were ready to have fun. Jazz inspired young Americans to think and behave more freely, which gave the Roaring Twenties the nickname the Jazz Age. Jazz emphasized the individual voice and had a great impact on all forms of pop culture, like the works of Langston Hughes and T.S. Eliot.
Jazz music was the cat's meow, and of course a main aspect of post-war popular culture. Weary of war, the people of the time period were eager to let off some steam. Different races were able to come together at night to relax, smoke, drink, and dance. The dances of the time included the Charleston, cakewalk, jitterbug, and the turkey trot. The main objective of popular culture during the 1920s was to challenge traditional customs. Rebellious teenagers listened to the music of black musicians in order to defy their parents. Women began to sport the bob to accent the diminishing length of their dress. The ultimate flapper became the role model for many young women. Jazz music also influenced authors such as Langston Hughes, T.S. Eliot, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who coined the term Jazz Age. Jazz was not only a type of music or dance, it was a lifestyle.
Jazz was successful in turning around the racial intolerance many people had towards African Americans. During the Jazz Age, racism began to disappear. White Americans respected Black Americans for their contributions in blues, ragtime, and jazz, although these genres were a response to repression in society. Artists like Duke Ellington treated jazz as a freedom for blacks, writing songs like Black and Tan Fantasy. Black Blacks were no longer treated as lower-class citizens. Senator James K. Vardaman even predicted that the word Negro would be obsolete by the 1920s. Instances of lynching and hangings decreased. In 1921, 59 lynchings occurred, but in 1929, only 7 lynchings occurred. These social improvements didn't affect the laws that repressed African Americans and had no impact on the Jim Crow laws of the South. Charles Cow Cow Davenport was one of many artists who sang about the political issues African Americans faced. He sang the Jim Crow Blues in 1927. Although African Americans gained recognition for their work in the music industry, they were often robbed of royalties and prospered little from their popular songs. In a period of time when 3 Republicans, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, were in power, some Americans had an urge to break from the old-fashioned ways. They rejected the accepted fashions and behavior and acted out. Older conservative Americans associated this behavior with the music they listened to, which caused them to dislike jazz and the blues. Jazz music and alcohol were in very close ties during the Roaring Twenties. While the purchasing of alcohol was illegal, speakeasies and clubs opened in urban areas like Boss Tom Pendergast's Kansas City Bar. Speakeasies in New York City included Club 21 and the 300 Club, where Tex Ginnon was the big cheese. These clubs served watered-down alcoholic drinks while daddies and their dames could enjoy the music of live bands. Whenever the 300 Club was raided, Ginnon would tell the band to play the Prisoner song, a signal for the guests to dry up fast. Ginnon exemplified the carefree attitude of the era by showing such a playful attitude towards the law.
Women played a large role in the cultural movement known as the Roaring Twenties. They changed their style by smoking in public and wearing short dresses, which allowed them to easily get in and out of cars. Some, in fact, drove their own cars. The change in women and their styles and trends impacted all of American society, and women were able to make their presence known. When jazz music first became popular, many women, dressed in their new short dresses, danced to famous jazz songs. They danced to the Charleston, the one-step, and the black bottom. Besides dancing, women found opportunities to become instrumentalists during this jazz age. They were not nearly as famous nor remembered as their male contemporaries, but there were some women that broke the barrier and showed America their talent. Female musicians in the early years of jazz played in jazz bands that included only women. Most famous female musicians were actually African Americans, which gave African American women more opportunities to find jobs, whereas before, white women were always hired over them. Dolly Jones, an African American trumpeter, was one of the first women to record jazz music. The fact that musicians were beginning to record their own songs showed how modernized the music industry was slowly becoming. Many female musicians became famous by playing the piano. African American pianist Lil Hardin became famous playing in King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. One of America's most famous jazz musicians, Louis Armstrong, eventually joined the band in 1922. Hardin and Armstrong developed a strong relationship and were eventually married. Hardin was the one who convinced her husband to start a solo career. Following her advice, Armstrong became one of America's most well-known musicians. Other African American pianists like Hardin emerged in the 1920s as well. Emma Barnett, or Sweet Emma, played in Papa Celestin and Babe Wrigley's original Tuxedo Orchestra starting in 1923. Jeanette Kimball joined the same orchestra in 1926. She toured with the orchestra and performed in the South for white audiences. Lovie Austin, another African American pianist, performed with the Theater Owners Booking Association. The most famous African American pianist of the time period was Mary Lou Williams. Although most women were not recognized for their talents during the time period, Williams became very well known. She was extremely talented and taught herself how to play the piano by ear. She started playing at rent parties when she was 6 years old. Rent parties were events featuring musicians that raised money for the host of the party's house rent. She was paid $1 an hour. She played gigs in Pittsburgh's union bands when she was 12 years old. While she was a teenager, Williams played with various local bands. Like Lovie Austin, she eventually joined the TOBA. In 1930, she recorded her first singles, Drag 'Em and Nightlife. Her singles brought her popularity and fame almost instantly. One of America's most famous female singers of the time period was Bessie Smith, another African American woman. She was known as the Empress of Blues. She recorded her songs Downhearted Blues and Gulf Coast Blues for the first time in 1923, accompanied by Clarence Williams. They sold 780,000 copies in 6 months. Smith also collaborated with Louis Armstrong in 1925 for St. Louis Blues and Cold in Hand Blues. These women show how the jazz age and cultural movement of the 1920s greatly impacted African American women, as well as the role of women overall. During the 1920s, music evolved to a point in which it became a very important part of American culture. Music gained popularity following World War I and became means for people to enjoy different styles such as jazz, blues, and ragtime, as well as to have fun and develop dances. Music was instrumental in providing job opportunities for African Americans. African Americans were given a taste of equality when many of them were given the opportunity to become musicians. Many African Americans that gained popularity through their music addressed the mistreatment of blacks in their songs. They sang about the Jim Crow laws, lynching, and other cruel acts implemented on them by white Americans. Women also played a role in music in the 1920s. Many women, especially African American women, became musicians in bands and orchestras. They commonly played the piano, though some played the trumpet or sang. The increasing popularity of music allowed them to obtain jobs in the music industry. It is apparent that music became a method for people to capitalize on many job opportunities. Music also implemented a carefree, cheerful attitude among people who just wanted to enjoy the songs and dance.